Hello everybody, welcome to our second Saturday of the season. Welcome back to the Historical Museum of Bay County. Excuse my appearance, I had to literally run home to get a laptop to fix this, so I'm a little late. Wore my running shoes, thankfully. So. Got my cardio in for the day. My name is Sam Fitzpatrick. I'm the education coordinator here at the museum. Just real quick, want to make some announcements. Coming up here in September and October, we have some walking tours of Hell's Half Mile. There are outrageously popular walking tour of the former red light district around Water Street and the accompanying streets downtown here, just a few blocks. September 16th, 21st, and the October dates are not in front of me, but they are on the website and the Facebook, and also our front desk, where I will be in a minute. Tickets are $10 a person. We leave at 1 p.m. sharp from the front steps of the museum. Anybody age 11 and under is $5 a person. Also, if anyone hasn't seen it yet, on the second floor we have our Michigan Rock and Roll Legends Hall of Fame exhibit. We have over 120 musicians from Michigan. It's more of a statewide exhibit examining over 120 artists, their music, and some surprises in the future, which we have cooking up right now for that. Yeah, this is also our last Saturday that we're open from 12 to 4, so when the presentation is over, feel free to wander the museum. There's no charge for the museum. Both floors are open. And without further ado, I will welcome our speakers up here who are going to talk about Pinconning's sesquicentennial, their 150th anniversary. Copies of these are available at $25 a piece. They have some up here, and these books talk about the history of Pinconning going back 150 years. So without further ado, I will welcome our three speakers up here, and cookies and coffee are available in the back, as well as punch. Bathrooms are on the first and second floor if anyone needs them. And okay, I'll hand it off to you guys.
Thank you. I'm Ellen Charlebois, and I am part of the Pinconning Arts Council. It's good to see you all here. I didn't know there'd be so much interest in Pinconning. How many of you are from Pinconning? Oh, all right. How many have connections up there? Oh, I can see the interest, and it's just a general interest in history, I'm sure. So as I said, I'm with the Pinconning Arts Council. We are a small 501c3 organization, and we facilitated the creation of this history book. So the organization first formed to build the Pinconning band shell. We are perhaps best known for putting on a free summer concert series called Tuesdays in the Park, all summer long in Pinconning. We hope to be putting on some cultural events in a newly renovated Pinconning Community Center during the winter. We're going to be putting on a big band birthday bash featuring a 15-piece orchestra in November. So you're wondering, well, why are they involved in a history book? Well, it is actually part of our mission, and it's enriching the lives of Northern Bay County residents. And the history books seem to be a good fit, because we had a lot of sesquicentennial events going on, a lot of contests, parties, picnic, fun things, but we wondered what's going to be here to recognize what happened during those 150 years. So the Arts Council decided to see if we could find people that would be willing to author a history book. We needed to find some money because we're a very small organization. We went to the Bay Area Community Foundation and applied for a grant, and the Northern Bay County Fund awarded us $2,000 for the first printing of that book. And we found some people willing to do some writing. And three of us are here today. So along with myself, Mike Stoner is here, Carol Maida, and unable to join us today is Mary LePan. So a little bit of background about the four of us. Two of us are relative newcomers to Pinconning. When did you move there, Mike?
30 years ago.
Yeah, me too, about 30 years ago, so that means you're a newcomer. But Carol and Mary were born and raised, and they have generations that have been there for multiple years, so they really had a strong connection in history. And I think everyone brought a little something to the party when it came to creating the history book. So we're going to talk a little bit about history, but we're also going to talk a little bit about what we did in order to create this history book, because we are not professional writers, historians, editors, we're just volunteers. And all four of us are very active in the community. So although retired, we're on numerous boards and committees and volunteering here and there. In general, busybodies maybe. So we learned a lot, right? So Mike's going to talk a little bit about some of the goals that we talked about as a committee and what we learned along the way.
Starting to do this book about 1.5 years ago, I guess it was, we got together. And the first issue you have to decide is why are we here? What are we going to do? What do we hope to accomplish? And especially when you're working with different people, everybody has a different viewpoint of what we might do. And one of the early decisions we made was that even though this is a 150th anniversary commemorative book, the history of the area began long before 150 years ago, and began, who knows, I guess with the creation of the earth, but we went back to like the Ice Age. How were the Great Lakes formed? Because that was an important feature that helped shape life in the area. Who were the people here before the European settlers came? Native peoples who were in the area. So we talked about that, how much we needed to set the stage, I guess you might say, for the coming of the European people of European descent, who then settled here and formed the Pinconning in 1872. But there were people here before that even. So anyway, we kind of decided that we wanted to do something that would last beyond the sesquicentennial. 30 years from now, 50 years from now, some people aren't going to remember the events that they had, the parades and stuff. They're not going to remember that. Well, some people will, but if they're new people, they're not going to remember that. But what would they like to know about the area that we were able to come up with? And Carol was a very important part of that, because she's in the local genealogical society, so she had lots of historical family connections to draw upon. We also then talked about, well, what is the definition of Pinconning? I mean, there's a city called Pinconning. It's only been a city for, I guess, in the 1930s. But there was a place called Pinconning. Local people referred to it as Old Pinconning, the place where the little potatoes grow, long before the Europeans came. And so what is Pinconning? So the focus we determined ultimately was the city of Pinconning, but also areas close by. And when we got into doing some areas like forestry and agriculture, well, obviously that's not just limited to the city of Pinconning. So we tried to do everything in context so that people who read this now or in the future, or even people who live there now who don't know their own history. I think that's a very common thing for everybody. We don't really know, most of us, a lot of the history of the place where we live. So with those I guess parameters in mind, we set out to divide up areas of interest. And so these are the subject areas, I guess you might say, in the beginning, which was what happened before the settlers came, which we started with the Ice Age and how the lakes were formed. One of the chapters, very interesting, was written by a native son who went on to become an archaeological professor in Kentucky. And as a boy, he gathered lots of Indian artifacts working with the farmers and so forth. And in the book, there's lots of pictures of items that he found probably 60 years ago at least. Anyway, he was good enough to actually write the chapter for us on that. So there's a pretty extensive history of local archaeological history, which certainly was beyond my ability to write, and he was very glad to do it. Notable people in the early years, including native peoples, logging, railroads, churches, education, government, agriculture, cheese, Pinconning, which, why is cheese made in Pinconning? There's information on the history of that process. Businesses, recreation, cultural activities, major fires, that seems, people might say, that's interesting, that's kind of odd, but except in the history of people in this area, fires were a very important thing in Bay City and elsewhere, because important facilities, which one day were there, the next day were gone, which is very common. Notable artists, there's some notable artists who are from the Pinconning area, and some of their works are shown in the book. Public safety, airports. And then the last parts, history repeats itself. We wrote this during the pandemic, COVID pandemic, and 100 years ago there was another pandemic in the area, you know, what was called the Spanish flu. And so, interesting that 100 years later we were going through some of the same things, and from history books we found some of the restrictions and other things were exactly the same 100 years ago as they were 2 years ago. It was interesting to make that connection. And then the last chapter, time capsule. People like to bury things and hope that 100 years from now somebody can find it. They remember to do it, you know. And so we said, well, that's, and they did do another time capsule in Pinconning. But we said, well, maybe we'll do a kind of a literary time capsule where we will capture this stuff and then it'll be available without having to dig something up or remember where it might be. So that's how the book ends. Anyway, and members of the committee took the lead on various parts of this. And I guess I would say, too, we're very lucky because there was no, you know, we didn't take ownership of these chapters, these things. We shared everything, and then when we were done, we gave it to others to read, because the worst person to edit your own work is you know, because then you're reading what you thought you wrote, not what you actually did write. And so we shared that, and people then found many things to say, you know what, do you really want to say it that way? Because I don't think. And people were open to that. That was very important, that people didn't feel offended if someone said, I don't really understand what this means, you know. So that was a big part of doing this book as well. And I think that's important if people are going to do this, you know, a giraffe is a horse designed by a committee, like they say. So this is a committee effort, but people were working together to make sure that they had the common goal. And I think Carol comes up now.
Yes, I do. I'm going to let you take that though, because I won't need it.
This?
Yeah, I don't need it. Oh, way up here.
Sorry.
It's okay. I'm Carol Maida. I belong to our local Pinconning genealogy group. We're an informal group, very small. We meet once a month. And for the sesquicentennial, we also sponsored First Families Contest, so we had some interest in that. So, but again, we're a very informal group. I did not come on board until December. Mary, who's not here, saw me or called me, I don't remember now. She goes, do you want to do churches? And I'm like, okay, you know. Well, I discovered that we had 10 churches at one time, and over the years. And now we have 6 remaining. But a lot of them had a lot of information. You know, churches, when they have a big anniversary, sometimes they'll put books out or yearly, and they have history. A few of them, though, I really had to dig. And I discovered we had one time had a Presbyterian church. Nobody in town even remembered it. But it was quite dramatic because, talking about fires, it disappeared in one of our large fires. One of the firebrands blew for a whole block, landed on the roof, burned the church down. They rebuilt it somewhere else. No one even remembered it. So there are new things in there. So anyway, what we have here is St. Michael's Church. St. Michael's is our largest Catholic church. We did have another one at one time, St. Agnes. St. Michael's started as the French church. You know, most of the churches, like our Lutheran church was the German church. Well, this was the French church. It started way back in 1879. There was no church, but they were on a circuit. A Jesuit would come from Chicago, and he'd ride on a horse, ride the circuit, and he would hit all the places, and people would gather in homes and do baptisms, weddings, you know, things that needed to be done. And his circuit took him up to Posen and Rogers City, and then he would come back down. So this church here, the first one there, was built in 1889, and it remained a mission church of St. Mary's in Bay City until 1891. So this was built as a mission church to begin with. It was donated lumber, donated time, donated horses, donated everything. In fact, I couldn't find, there's a rumor the property was donated by one of our first families, but we couldn't find any supporting evidence of that. But anyway, that's how they did things then. They had building bees. So that's how they built that church. So they celebrated the first Mass in that church in April 1889. And the church was, as you can imagine, a lot of those frame buildings were not, the foundations weren't good. So it got pretty shaky. So in 1961, it was replaced with this church. That church there, you can see where the rectory in the back and the portico there, that's where that church sat. So they built this church behind, while they were using that church, they built this one behind it. And it wasn't completed, and then they tore that one down. And not in the book, because we didn't have room in the book, but I remember when I was just 6 years old, but we lived right near there. So there's a parking lot for the school right in front. Everyone was lined up. And they came and they pulled that tower down first to dismantle the church. And it came down this way, and squirrels just ran out all over the place. So that was one of my first childhood memories, was when they took that tower down. So anyway, so the new church, they had, moving day was the night before Easter. So Easter Vigil was held in the new church, and the new church had a seating capacity of over 700. So it's a much larger church. The only thing they kept, except for some articles that they used for Mass and things like that, but everything was new except the old church bell. It was cast in 1904. They electrified it and they placed it in the new bell tower, and it rings from the new bell tower up there today. So that's the old bell. It's over 100, well, almost 120 years old now. So that's St. Michael's Church. And again, I did do some of the churches I really had to dig. I spent hours and hours going through old newspapers, hours and hours, days and days, weeks and weeks and weeks. Because some people didn't remember the Presbyterian Church. So that meant I had to go through all these papers and try to figure out what happened to it. And other churches too. Some churches, a lot of information, the bigger churches that had been there. Some of the newer churches didn't have a lot of history, but the people were very gracious. They gathered things together for me from their church. They were very, very helpful. So anyway, I was on board in December. I did churches, and then it just kept taking subjects, didn't I? So yes, so that's the churches.
One of the areas that was kind of near and dear to me was agriculture, because we know of shipbuilding, we know of lumbering, and those were important things through this whole region. Lumbering, though, was fairly short-lived in terms of it had great impact long-term, but in terms of employment, once the trees were gone, then what? It turns out that there were people here during the people in Pinconning lumbering era, but people didn't really start arriving until the trees were cleared and the agriculture began. Because then, in Pinconning area, the German and Polish farmers from Europe came and brought with them things like sugar beets, chicory, other things which then became important agricultural products in all of this area, but not just Pinconning. But we want to make sure that we highlighted that, because many of the descendants of those people are still there, are still here. And so it was interesting to explain how were sugar beets produced here, why were sugar beets produced here, why were the other products which the area is known for now, how did they happen to start here? So there's information on that. This picture was simply to show the change. it was interesting to read old agricultural reports from the state. At the time of the Second World War, I forget the number now, but it was thousands of horses were used in farming in Bay County, thousands. And within 10 years after the end of the the Second World War, the number was maybe 100 or 2. Everything had been mechanized, all during the war. All of the industrial production was for war efforts. They were not building a lot of tractors for people to use or other things. So people were still using horses, and it was astounding to me, the number that were still in use here. So this is kind of a then and now picture. The top picture, the Dalkey family, a farm family in the Pinconning area, with their horses. Teams of horses were important things. And today, where with the highly mechanized agriculture, one of the things that local people watch, when the fields are being planted or being harvested, because the gulls, not seagulls, but the gulls come in from the bay and swarm. This is taken in front of my house. Thousands of them are following the tractors through the fields, and it's actually kind of an interesting phenomenon, I guess you might say, to watch that, so when that activity is going on. So anyway, agriculture and the various products that were produced or grown in this area are part of the book.
So another topic area was recreation, and again showing where things were yesterday and up to today. And these photos are from the Bay County Pinconning Park, which wasn't always a Bay County location. It was owned by the city of Pinconning for a while. I believe it was owned by the DNR for a while, but it was really a tourist destination for many years, going back to the early 1900s, and it was known as Hazel Beach for many, many years. It's the beach area between Pinconning Road and the Pinconning River. And in 1939, a group of volunteers really put some effort into it to clear that area, and it became much more of a tourist destination. And I'll read the names with all the Pinconning people in here. You'll probably know who some of them are. The volunteers included Frank Duranchek, John and Louis Scarback, Stitch Werner, and Fred Guys. So they put the elbow grease into Hazel Beach, and it became a destination. Again, in 1940, the city chipped in and added some benches, picnic tables, grills, so that it became more of a picnic area. In 1956, there were more volunteers. It was the Pinconning JCs that made more improvements. And then in 1989, Bay County took over the park, and it has just exploded since then. There are cabins, there's kayaks, there's a boat launch. So we moved from this lovely marina that I believe was privately owned at the time, but wiped out probably during floods, and now it's still going. So the tourists have remained constant in Pinconning. Mike talked about the lumbering going away, but the railroads came as part of the lumbering. And those railroads began bringing people up from Bay City to Linwood and Pinconning to spend the day or spend the night. The town used to be full of cottages and cabins where people would come and swim at Hazel Beach. So it's been a popular destination and is today. And part of that is cheese, and we'll talk about that a little later too. The other areas we covered in recreation, and again, the people with connections to Pinconning would find me to be remiss to not mention this, but we covered baseball. And baseball was an important, and still is a very important, recreational activity in Pinconning. So there's a good amount of information about baseball and also boxing. The Golden Gloves were held in a popular sport up there in Pinconning at the community center.
And I did work on public safety, but before I talk about the fire department, something that goes on with what Mike said there about the horses. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father were blacksmiths. So my great-grandfather had a blacksmith shop in town, and at the time, when he first came here in 1907, there were or here in Pinconning in 1907, there was sometimes three blacksmiths going. They were busy. They had to repair farm implements, and this was all going. But in World War II, the grandsons went off to war, and there was no work. So they closed down the last blacksmith shop in town during the war because no more horses. So that was, so anyway, also, and with the, along with the farming, a lot of people were surprised. I mean, people who lived there forever knew this, but we had 4 elevators in town at one time, 4 different elevators. And it wasn't just for grain. They would process the things in town. Instead of the pickles going off somewhere else to be processed, the pickles and cucumbers, they did them right in town. We canned tomatoes, ketchup in town. Beans were a big thing. People they got on lines and they picked through the beans to clean the beans. So things were not, it was a small town and things were processed closely. And that's why the cheese came in, because farmers had the milk. They had to get the milk somewhere quickly because of lack of refrigeration. So every community had cheese. So in Pinconning, it came to be quite an industry. So, Hazel Beach too, another thing I wanted to mention. Not only was it a tourist place and did people go out and swim, back around the turn of the 1900s, turn of the century, it would be hot in town in the summer. So if some of the business people whose wives weren't working would take the kids, pack up, and they'd go live in a cottage out at the bay. And that's what they did in the summertime. And the father would go out in the evenings and spend the evening with them where it was cooler by the water. So it was utilized a lot. We really utilized our little piece of Saginaw Bay. So here we have a picture of the 1949 Studebaker. That truck they still have. I don't know, they're kind of shaky on if it runs now, but they've been using it for parades and funerals for quite some time. So they still have that truck. And the first they had to have fire protection in Pinconning. It was a lumber town, it was a mill town. Fires were constant. So they originally had a hose cart, which they would, some places they'd hook them up to horses, but I think in Pinconning, a couple guys would get the thing and they'd drag it over to wherever they needed it, hook it up to a hydrant, and they'd start pumping. They had the pumps on each side, and someone would train the hose on the fire. And sometimes they were actually successful. They did save a lot of buildings with that. But then there were times that it wasn't successful. And I could not find names of those volunteers. I think any able-bodied man in town was probably a fireman at that time. And they did have hydrants at an early time, though I could not find when they got their hydrants. But they would hook this pump up to a hydrant. So the first truck, the actual fire truck they got was in the 1920s. They got their first fire truck, so they were pulling that hose cart around until then. So the 1949 Studebaker, the chief at the time, Harry Senecal, is in the passenger seat there, and I could only identify one of the other guys. No one could tell me who they were, which was kind of sad. But anyway, and that is in front of their fire department, which is near where City Hall is today. So this is, over here is Station 15. This is where they are located today. It is now attached to, for a while, the city of Pinconning had fire service and the townships did not. Well, the dates are in the book. I don't have them up here with me. Eventually, they joined with Fraser and the township of Pinconning and Pinconning City, and they formed a fire department. So now when they built the new station, they built it out adjacent to Pinconning Township Hall. So that's where they're stationed now, and that truck is in the back somewhere. You can't see it. But that is a neat truck. If you like old trucks, that's a neat one.
We have a section in the book on, who's notable. That's a debatable question. But we tried to pick people from different eras who some of the local people might know or might not know, but if they didn't know them, they ought to, kind of. There's a book written recently by a lady from Midland on Mr. Lincoln's, I forget what it's called. It's
Lincoln's Army.
Mr. Lincoln's like Native American Army. During the Civil War, the Union Army needed people early on, and many Native people tried to join, but they would not accept them because they were not citizens, first off, and they were suspect. And there were a lot of Native people in this area. The gentleman on the left here was born either Saginaw or Saganine, which is near Pinconning. There's some debate on that, but he tried to join the Union Army in about 1861, I think. They would not take him, and they have information. He recorded this information. They didn't want Indians because they're afraid they would scalp them, is what he was told. So, as the war went on, they found out that they were less fussy about who they would let die on behalf of the country. So this gentleman he joined the Michigan Sharpshooters, which is one of the most important units during the Civil War of Native Americans, most of them from Michigan. Well, they were from Michigan because it was the Michigan Sharpshooters unit. They served in many famous battles, Sharpsburg and the Wilderness and other ones. He was injured twice. This is a picture of the actual man, Thomas Kichitigo, at an Army hospital in Virginia, taken in, I think, 1864. And this is in the National Archives. They had this picture, which I was astounded that they would have this picture, but they did. After the war, he came back and lived in Pinconning. He raised 2 families of 6 children with 2 different women who all died of smallpox. His entire family was wiped out, both of his families. He ended up, he worked after Pinconning, he worked in lumber camps, he worked various places. He's buried in Grayling now with Chief Chappanagan. Anyway, we have interesting information about him from the book and other places that this was a connection to the Civil War of a local individual who was, the sharpshooters unit was, like I say, one of the top units during the Civil War because those folks knew how to hunt. I mean, that was their livelihood. And it's interesting, some of the quotes from him where he joined the units where they were working with other Union soldiers, and he said, "Why are you wearing these bright blue uniforms? You're too easy. Roll in the dirt, roll in the mud." So he showed the Union folk, you don't need to look pretty, you just need to stay alive so you can do your job. And stories like that. Anyway, Thomas Kichitigo, which, that's him, injured in the hospital in the Civil War. Arthur Summerfield, some of you may be old enough to remember President Eisenhower. The Postmaster General of the United States was Arthur Summerfield, who was from Pinconning. He was born and raised in Pinconning. He went on to own one of the largest GM dealerships in the United States, Summerfield Chevrolet in Flint, if you're familiar with that. This was him, his family. He was Postmaster General for 8 years under President Eisenhower. He did a lot of modernization of the postal service, mechanized a lot of things. He was also kind of a controversial figure because during the 50s there was a lot of suspicion of communists and other people. He was kind of notorious for managing the mails for political purposes, I guess you might say. But those are the times. I mean, he was not out of step. That was the way it was. But anyway, he's from Pinconning, which was, I thought, very interesting that an important person like that, who people locally probably wouldn't even remember. The last person is Lee Bowser, who is one of the local artists here, who in Pinconning, in businesses and churches, everything, he painted scenes of Pinconning. Sometimes the fields, but oftentimes buildings and wildlife. And this is a picture of him painting a picture. And if you go into places like Pirtles or Williams Cheese, places like that, you will see Lee Bowser, the original artwork that people have kept. And in the book itself, some of the buildings are shown in the artwork of Lee Bowser as opposed to a photograph, which is kind of interesting. St. Michael's Church and others, there's photographs of the paintings that he did of those places. So anyway, we couldn't highlight everybody, but we wanted to do a kind of a cross-section of interesting people in the Pinconning area who most people even locally might not know, and certainly beyond Pinconning would not know.
So another topic area that we covered was business. And it was a lot of discussion about what businesses to include and what businesses not to include. So we kind of settled on a set of criteria that a business needed to be up and running at least 75 years ago, and they needed to be operating yet today. And that's a pretty tall order. So we ended up with 10 businesses that met that criteria. And I think that's a pretty large number for a very small town. And we're just going to talk about 3 of them out of the book today. And of course, one of those businesses is going to have to be cheese, because we are Pinconning. So this is a photograph of the Wilson's Cheese Shop in 1939. A family called the Horn family started, or actually took over a creamery, I think, Carol, the Halperin Creamery. And Dan Horn came in, and with that creamery product, he created cheese. Well, his family grew. They ended up opening a retail operation, which is here in this photograph. And shown in the photograph is Virginia Wilson and Doris Horn. And Virginia's the daughter of Lawrence and Inez. Inez is the person that created the marketing behind Pinconning cheese. And when you see that beautiful big mouse up on M13 that a lot of tourists stop and get their photo by, it was Inez that came up with that idea. So Pinconning cheese met that criteria, or the Wilson's Cheese Shop in particular. But as Carol mentioned, there were cheese makers all over the area. So there was a lot of discussion about which cheese makers do we include. Are we including the people in Linwood? Are we including the people west and north? And we decided to focus just right there in Pinconning when it came to cheese. So the Horn family were really the beginning of Wilson's cheese as they married.
So a lot of you have seen this building. It doesn't look like this now. This is Valley's Meat Market. This building was built in 1905 or 1906. There was a fire. Mr. Mansfield there in the middle, he came to Pinconning in 1888, and eventually he got in the grocery business. And he was burned. He lost everything in a fire. He had a frame building, and he lost everything. So he built a block building, and it remains there. Now, at the time, he built it so it could host 2 businesses. And when I was a child, and other people will remember this too, there were 2 entrances. This one was closed off. You went in the other one, which the storefront was identical. So for a while, he would rent this out to other people. He'd rent out half of it to other people. So Louis Valley Sr., who is on the right here, he came into the business in 1921. He started working there early. Louis was from the area, and he started working there early. In 1921, Mr. Mansfield, who was getting on in years, sold the business to Louis and a partner. So eventually, Louis took over the business. So they are now into the 4th generation of Louis Valleys running the store. So that business is still there. It is a destination. People stop on their way up north to get their meat there, and it's quite an interesting building. And upstairs, there's 2 apartments upstairs, but at one time part of it was a roller rink upstairs. They've used it for hall, for different purposes, but people actually roller skated upstairs, like in the 30s. They were roller skating there. So that's one of our businesses that we are proud to say is ours.
This is, we mentioned that Lee Bowser had done pictures of businesses in Pinconning. This is Pirtle's restaurant, I think in about 1940, that era. And who in this room has been to Pirtle's in Pinconning? Right. So how can you not do a thing about Pinconning without Pirtles? Yeah, most, I shouldn't say most, in the old days, probably most young people got their start working at Pirtles.
Turtles are the bakery.
Right. I mean, so Pirtles has been in existence since 1925, and for most of those years, it was owned by the same family. It was sold a few years ago to another group, but Kathy Pirtle, who is the granddaughter of the founder, is still running the place, still working there. So I was really pleased when I asked her. I said, you know, people who are not from Pinconning, what do you know about Pinconning if you're headed north on Old US 2375? You know the cheese stores, you know Pirtles, you know Idziar's maybe. Now you know Northwoods. I mean, what do people know? And so the places that people know, we ought to at least give a little background on. So the Pirtles, or their name is actually Pertel, and you can, not in Pinconning, yeah, you know locals because they call it Pirtles. And Kathy Pirtle said it was a bit of an aggravation for the family for a while, but finally they gave up. This is who we are, this is what people call us. As long as they come and spend money here, I guess we don't care what they call us. Anyway, so, but I won't go into all of it obviously, but the history of this store and how to go from dairying to cheese making to ice cream, because as the wars intervened, First World War, Second World War, certain types of milk were no longer available. They were taken by the government for cheese to ship to Europe. So they had to be innovative. And so ice cream was an innovation during the Second World War, or just after. And up until the 90s, the ice cream was made there. Kathy Pirtle's father made ice cream there. When he retired finally, they thought nobody is going to do, I mean, thousands of gallons of ice cream every month, you know, nobody's going to do that. So now they import it. But Kathy Pirtle said that when she was a young girl, 8 years old, she started working in the store, which would have been 1950s sometime. She said on a Sunday afternoon, if you're old enough to remember going up north before I-75 was in place, you came up 75 till you got to Calcallan, the freeway ended. You came up US 23 through all the towns, and you know, Turkey Roost, remember when the turkeys were out there? Linwood, Pinconning, the cheese stores, the ice cream stores, Sterling, the hatchery there where you could actually go see the chickens hatching, who were then made into chicken dinners by Iva. Kathy said on a Sunday afternoon in the 50s when she was a kid, the cone kids is what they're still called, the kids who work there who dip cones, and that's a full-time job on some days. She said they would do as many as 5,000 ice cream cones on a Sunday afternoon, because the people headed back to southern Michigan from US 23 and up from, you know, M76 through West Branch. They would all stop there. They would stop and buy some cheese. They would stop and get an ice cream cone. 5,000. She said we just stood there and filled ice cream cones for hours. Anyway, it's interesting. I think it's interesting. I thought it was important that we cover some of these local businesses like that to give people a sense of what it was like, but also that it's still there. And if you go on a summer evening to Pinconning, to Pirtles, just watch the people troop in to get an ice cream cone. They give you huge ice cream cones too. I mean, people are so impressed. Like a single scoop is like this big, you know. But anyway, so this was one of the ones we highlighted. We also did Idziar Furniture, which is another interesting story. A Polish family came from Poland they finally got into this business. So I mean, there's some interesting tidbits like that on some of the businesses which are still there and which are still successful.
Up here is a list of people that helped us. The four of us couldn't have done this on our own at all. There were numerous people that were interviewed, people that provided photos, people that provided information, and so we really need to stress how much it was a group effort to get this book completed. So we're very thankful for all of the help from everyone. We do have books available for sale. And they're hot off the press. We just picked them up last night. The first 100 books that we purchased, they were such a big hit that we took advance orders, and another 140 were sold. If you're interested in a book today, you can pick one up. We have a copy up here that is in some cellophane so you can thumb through it, even if you have sticky fingers, and see what the book's all about. Thank you all very much for listening to us talk on a little bit about our favorite place in the world, Pinconning, Michigan, and we hope you enjoyed the afternoon. Thanks for being here. Any questions?
You talked about the lumbering just a little bit. That was how they originally started.
Yes, yeah. And actually, that was one of the topics I was very interested in myself. My neighbor was Bud Schultz, and Mary LePan, as you probably know, is his daughter, and she was on our book committee. But Bud used to tell a lot of stories. He was kind of an unofficial local historian, and he pointed out some various railroad tracks in the area that went out from the city to the bay, and you could still see the evidence of those tracks, and that's how they were moving lumber out from west of Pinconning to the bay, where it'd be dropped onto a barge and brought down the Saginaw River eventually to be milled. So the lumbering and the railroads were all very interesting, and it's really what started that area up there. If it wasn't for the lumbering, there wouldn't have been the railroads and there wouldn't have been a city.
I grew up outside of Linwood, across from Hintz's Cheese, and I used to go over there and watch the mixers go through the vats for hours on end. Anyway, is any cheese still made in Pinconning?
No, I don't think there's any made. There is a recipe for Pinconning cheese, and so they subcontract that recipe out. And I think most of it's Wisconsin, do you know?
I think so.
Yeah.
And then, Williams, though,
Yeah.
which is south of us, now they don't make the cheese, but they do them. You know how you buy their cheese spreads that they have different mixes? They do those there. So they process it, but the actual cheese is not made there anymore.
And the cheese that Williams makes is award-winning, those cheese spreads, so it's, yeah.
I was down in Tennessee visiting my brother and walked into this Amish store, and they've got this big display about cheese spreads. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And I walk over, it says Williams Cheese. And I'm thinking,
It's marked up quite a bit, probably.
About that, I was talking to Mike Williams, who owns the Williams Cheese now, and he said that Pinconning cheese is a locally known name, but he said in other states, nobody ever heard of Pinconning cheese. So several years ago, they bought the Amish label. It's Amish something, I forget what it is now. But he said, by doing that, they were selling the very same products, but now they ship semi-loads to places like New York and South Carolina and other places, because people have heard of Amish, but they've never heard of Pinconning. So that was a marketing strategy which allowed them to expand their business tremendously without having to change their product, which was kind of interesting. But he bought the label, and he said it made a huge difference in what they were able to then sell.
And it really had nothing to do with the Amish.
No, nope, just the label. It's a Pinconning for
Yeah,
art.
but it's
Amish-
true advertising.
she had her hand up for me. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to say my grandfather ran a lumber yard in Pinconning
Oh, really?
in the 1920s, and I have pictures I've written up.
What's the name?
Fred Compo.
Oh, okay.
Teresa's dad.
Huh?
Teresa, I know Teresa.
That's my aunt.
I know.
And I wrote a Compo history because it's very in between Saginaw, Detroit, Grand Rapids, but locally I have some pictures of the lumber yard and different things that were up here. When I was a kid, I lived with my grandparents in Pinconning, 3rd grade, went to St. Michael's, made first communion there. And so all these names up there, yes. Yes. I love it. I love it. Yeah,
Excellent.
yeah.
Excellent.
So, yeah.
You do have to be careful when you talk to people in Pinconning, because everybody is related.
That's what you have
They are, yeah.
to do. Or I do too. It's the same thing from the families with my husband. You gotta behave because somebody's gonna tell.
well, I'd like to hear a little bit about the school system, maybe a few minutes about the history of the school system and how long has the current school building been around? How old is it?
I'm going to have Mary come up and answer. I'm not
Carol.
Mary.
Yeah, Mary
Carol,
did
because
it.
Mary did the
Mary
subject.
did it, but I could
being a
kinda jump
local,
in.
yeah.
Okay, so we do have all that in here. And actually, there have been several different schools. The Lutherans, in the church thing here, hold on. So, the Lutherans had a parochial school, and they built a schoolhouse in 1895. So they had that one originally, they had one. And then, schools.
I'm assuming a one-room?
Yeah, it was a one-room, and it was not, do you know where the Lutheran church is now? Well, here, no, wait a minute, they moved it. At the Lutheran church, it follows it in the book, it's been moved several times. But it was originally out on Pinconning Road, and then they used that building several different places. They used to move the buildings around, so when they built a church in town, they moved that building to town, and they used it for Sunday school. So they would move these buildings around when they built them. They didn't waste anything then. So the village school, though, then we had the Indian school, corner of Pinconning and Maloney Road. And that building was built in 1873 to replace a log building. So that was built then. And that was actually part of the Pinconning School District. That was District Number 1. And that was, it was called the Indian School, but the local children also went there. So then, Pinconning Village School, which is District Number 2, was constructed in 1875. And where that was on Mercer Street between 2nd and 3rd Street. There is a bank, independent, there's a credit union there now. Bank Community Credit Union is on that block now. And it was built facing Mercer Street. Well, that burned, and that was a wood building. It burned in 1904. No one was hurt, everyone was going home for lunch. So then they built the big brick one that was there. My mother came to teach in that building in 1952. So that was on the highway, on the same block. It was across from the bakery. So that building was there until the 50s. Then they built the school, they built the shop building first. They used that for some of the classes. Then they built the school in the 50s. So that original school, let me see, which year was that one built? 1956 was when the building that they're using now was built. But then we also had other area schools because there was the Frenchtown School building still there on Cody Estee near Mackinac. That building is still there. There was White Feather School. There were a lot of little schools that they all combined for it to be Central Elementary, which was behind the high school that you see now. So
I know there were a lot of 1- and 2-room schoolhouses around, and they all consolidated about 56 or 57.
To make Central Elementary, yes, Central, yeah.
My school was Olagwood School.
Oh, yes.
Road, and that was torn down.
Yeah.
Expressway 75.
Yeah.
And we went to Linwood School now.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the mid-1950s, 27 local school districts consolidated to form the Pinconning Area School District,
Yeah.
to answer your question. So they were all, each township, well, more than one per township even, there were local schools, and they all consolidated because it was getting to be impractical to manage all those things. And the current high school was built in the 56, but it was completely renovated about 8-9 years ago, something like that. It looks the way it looked in 1956 in the front. It is completely, in order to convince the people to pass a millage to do it, they turned down a millage request to build a new building. People were not willing to do that. But they were willing to pass a millage to renovate the current building, which
Probably cost more.
well, I don't know if it costs more. I think it actually costs a little bit less. They did, but they have a brand new, beautiful gym and live, media center. So people were happy that they have a wonderful facility, but they're also proud that they didn't have to pay to build a new building. I mean, so there's kind of that whole. But that was a many-year activity to get that done. But now, even though it doesn't look, if you go to Stanley Sterling High School, which is a fabulous. And you compare that to Pinconning, you say, oh, Pinconning doesn't have that. But inside, it's a it's a very modern and functional
They
building.
give tours, so I'd like to see it.
I'm sure this district would love to give you a tour. Yeah, beautiful gym, beautiful locker rooms. I mean, now they're, well, I don't know, but they're doing a lot of exterior work with fields and lighting the football field, all kinds of stuff going on. So.
And I've got to put in a plug for St. Mike's, because that was a K-12 system for a long time. And then when I started, it was the second grade, but our class was the last class out of it. 1966, it closed as a high
The
school.
high school, the elementary school is still open.
The elementary school is still there,
Yeah.
but yeah,
It
they,
actually has a few more students than it did, and most schools are getting, they actually have more students than they did a few years ago, so
Yeah, yeah.
they're doing well, I guess.
Yeah, it was kind of that we graduated, both graduated in '66, but I was in Pinconning and she was in St. Michael's. And the kids from St. Michael's, they didn't have every class there, so they would go over to Pinconning and share classes with us and then go back. So they went, what, half and half?
oh yeah, yeah.
There's
So-
still a good bit of cooperation between the schools there.
With busing and
today.
things like that.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, my grandparents were, they had a farm on Mackinac, Cody Esty Road, that was my maiden name, that was their name. And I was always told the road was somehow named after our
Cody's?
family from way back, yes.
Oh, yeah,
Do
it
you know
was.
when that took place? And Esty was the village, I just always knew. And the farm's no longer there, they took that house down in 59.
Well, Peter Cody was the township
He was the
supervisor
son,
for
yep,
years.
My great uncle.
And then, but before that, so they were very active in the township. Yeah, they were. I don't know when they named the road and all that. That's just how they named roads then. Yeah.
Yeah, because they were originally, when they came over, French Canadian, Irish heritage, and they were up there way back,
Mm-hmm.
you know, grandparents and then their family.
But nobody from your family did the first family project.
I
How disappointing.
I didn't know if anything
Oh,
from it.
sorry.
Yeah, no, I would like to know more. I
You should
just,
get the Pinconning Journal and you know all these things.
Yeah. Yes, and that's true. Yeah. Yeah.
Did anybody ask about Deer Acres when it's reopening? Just thought I'd throw that in there.
Do you know something we don't?
You never know.
Okay, inquiring minds want to know.
No,
What about
not
Deer Acres?
saying a word.
Anything else people?
Well, I laughed because my grandparents moved to Worth, and we were talking about it. To clear the land, my grandmother would talk about how they go to the hardware store and get dynamite because you had to blow the stumps out of the field. And I'm thinking, okay, if I went to the hardware store today, then I would be on a terrorist watch list. I was just taking for granted that you go blew the stumps out of the field to clear the land.
Did you have any information about H&H Bakery? What,
Yes, there's information on H&H.
who founded that? What was the?
Harris and Hefner, was it Harris and
Yeah.
Hefner?
Yes.
I think they were brothers in law.
Yeah, the granddaughter is actually living in Pinconning, so she provided a lot of information to us. Yeah.
She used to run the bakery.
Yes.
When it was
Yeah.
Motion Bakery.
Oh, Alvin and his, see, J.B. Harris owned the hardware in town, and he had a lot of money. Well, his father-in-law, Alvin Hepner, that was his father-in-law, so they opened it together. And so that's when it was opened in 1947. So, yeah.